We're still in the same place as we were 2 years ago. I guess the question would be, are you in the same place as you were 2 years ago?
Well, hopefully not, because I didn't make it last time. No, I think I'm in a different position than I was last time when I came to speak to you. For once, I gave myself a little bit more than 91 days to run this candidacy and get the message out. And I do believe that the campaign has been a little bit smoother as a result of that, and I have been able to touch more of the voters, which is the goal.
So, in 2014, you had two primary competitors. In this time, I guess you've got one main competitor. What sets you apart?
Well, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened last time, too. Last time I was able to do 91 days, a blitz campaign, where I got almost 20% of the vote in a three-way race. How I got into this race was because a lot of people across the state were contacting me constantly, saying, hey, can you please run? And after I got my family's buy-in, I decided to jump in. And I think that's important because I entered this race with a lot of support that I'm very thankful for. And I think one of the things that separates me is that base of support that I had before I got into the race. I didn't choose to run, just based on my own opinion. I chose to run because there was a base out there that liked what I had to say 2 years ago and asked me to run again. And in addition to that, I have the most breadth of experience of any of the candidates running in the Republican side. I served 3 terms in the State House as a state legislator. I'm also an Air Force veteran. I'm not happy to say that I'm one of the few veterans that are actually on a ticket for a higher level race in this state. I think that's a very important distinguishing point to make here. I was fortunate enough to graduate from the United States Air Force Academy, and I served just under 7 years active duty in the Air Force after that. But I'm also a small businessman, and family man and proud parent of 8 children. So if you look at all the life experience that I have, all the work experience that I have, all the legislative experience that I have, on top of being a veteran, that separates me very clearly from the rest of the field in this race.
And just to follow up slightly, in your mind, are there any significant policy differences between you and your Republican opponent?
Well, there are a few. If you look, and I'll go right down the list, I was the first candidate to get involved in this race to really hone in on fiscal policy and to talk particularly about what the potential issues would be carrying a $19.2 trillion debt forward. I feel very strongly about that. I do believe that we have a certain responsibility to future generations of Americans to keep our financial house in order, particularly in Washington, D.C. We've seen the Fed Reserve Chairman actually coming online saying some similar things to this as well. So I think that's definitely something that Congress should take more seriously than they have in the past. Beyond that, my experience and background in military, I think, put me in a unique position to really hone in on what the future American foreign policy should be, what our defense posture should be, how we can efficiently and effectively field our military assets, for example. They kind of go hand in hand. We've got a national debt issue, but we may potentially have a military readiness issue and a military training issue, and it's going to be very difficult for our future government to be able to deal with both of those. So you want to send somebody down to Washington that has a whole lot of experience in both fiscal policy, federal budget policy, military readiness. I'm the candidate that has that. I've got over 2 decades of federal budget and programming experience under my belt. So that's a big distinguishing factor there as well. If you look in terms of our positions on the role of government, regulatory issues, taxation issues, there are some differences there as well. I mean, me being a small business owner, I think I know very well what the obstacles are that government puts in the way of small businesses. You guys are part of a small business here. You're dealing with the issues that government brings forward in terms of regulatory issues for compliance. So there's some distinguishing marks there as well.
You mentioned foreign policy, and we'll get to that in just a moment. I want to start out with what seems to be one of the major talking points nationally in this year's campaigns. At a point when it seemed like almost a dead issue, Donald Trump brought immigration to the front of the national consciousness, and everybody's talking about the build a wall. And I remember when you were here 2 years ago, you were advocating a stronger, secure border as well. But he's also talked about deporting millions of people and limiting access to refugees, having people sign up if they're Muslim. What are your thoughts on immigration issues? Where do you differ?
Okay.
What of those policies do you feel you're the same?
I'll go back to what I said 2 years ago. I took a pretty strong stance saying that I wanted to secure our border, and the reason that I gave was for security purposes primarily. I still believe that's an important factor. We know now that we're dealing with a drug crisis in this state and across the country, and one of the things that a secure border brings with it is your ability to stop some illegal narcotics from crossing into your country. I think that's a relevant point here, and if we had a secure border, we might have been able to stop some of that from coming into our country. My plan to secure the border is a little bit different from what Donald Trump is saying. I look particularly at the southern border. It's 2,000 mile plus border. The terrain may not be reasonable to build a wall or a fence across that entire length. So what I was advocating, and still would advocate at this point in time, is that you can build a wall or fence where it's practical, but where that's not practical, you can use electronic countermeasures and augment that with manpower. That's probably the most effective and efficient way to secure that border as quickly as possible. I do believe that's the first step that we should take in terms of dealing with not only a border security issue, but also any kind of immigration issue that you're looking at. Once you've done that, now you can talk about having an intelligent conversation about what types of immigration reforms you're going to look at, and what types of provisions that you want to put in place. Right now, we know that our immigration policies and laws are unfortunately for the largest portion unenforceable. We know that. So we need to take a long, hard look at that and figure out where we can make smart decisions to make laws that make sense, adjust our tactics so that we can enforce what laws we decide to put on the books at that time. And lastly, in terms of immigration, not necessarily immigration, but you asked a question about refugees. There's a lot of talk out there about what our policy should be. I want to get this right out there up front. I think that we do owe the American people due diligence to provide for their overall safety and for the security of the United States. So somewhere in that mix, that conversation has to be made. Does that mean that I'm supporting a ban on Muslims? No, that's not what that's not what my policy or what I would advocate for. But I do think that we do need to take prudent steps in order to guarantee Americans' safety. Right now, I'm not sure that we're necessarily doing that with the current vetting process, so I would want to take a long, hard look at that.
Okay. Speaking of foreign policy, you touched on a little bit of this before. Obviously, you have some background here on your website when it comes to. I'd like to break it down into specific areas, because obviously we can't just talk about it as one huge area. But before I do that, you mentioned having a cautioned and measured response on your website, but you also mentioned winning decisively.
Mm-hmm.
And those are two things that, when you look at military strategy, can sometimes seem to be at odds, especially with regard to the situations over there. So how would you implement that? What does winning decisively look like? And I guess I would start in Syria.
Okay. Syria is probably a good place to start, considering what's going on over there right now. I don't know if you caught the last debate that I had, the WGIR debate, but there was an exchange that resulted in me weighing in on what my opponent proposed, which was to send Marines into Syria to create a safe zone so that Syrian refugees would have a safe place to reside in their own country. That's an untenable situation, unfortunately. That is a plan that has no end game and no path to victory. So I would not be an advocate of that for two reasons. One, I don't believe that realistically we could plan for a victory in that type of effort in the foreseeable future. And it also represents what I would call a police action. And I'm not an advocate of utilizing the United States Armed Forces for police actions around the world. I don't think that's what their role is, or what we should lawfully utilize them for. That being said, a decisive victory, it starts, in my mind, it starts with good planning. You look at an achievable objective. You have to define what your goal is ahead of time. And it has to be something that's realistic, achievable. But if you're going to use United States Armed Forces to do it, in my mind, it can only be used for our own safety, protection, and our direct national interests.
So what is the end goal in Syria then, that you would seek to devise strategy toward? What is the ideal situation?
Well, right now, the ideal situation is for the United States to detangle itself from what I perceive right now to be something that has been allowed to migrate to an unwinnable position. You've got a situation in the northern part of that country where the Russians are working closely with the Assad regime. That's become largely a no-go zone for us. You have radical Islamists on the eastern side of the country there. And unfortunately, we're having difficulty getting the Gulf states to buy into serious or taking serious steps to try and solve the issue within their own region. So you're running out of diplomatic options there. And we're trying very hard to continue a fight against radical Islamists in the area. And if you look at that situation right now, I mean, I don't know where does it ever end? Where do we declare victory at what point? I don't see the achievable goal in the foreseeable future there. So my position would be to advocate not using United States military in efforts where there's no clear end game in sight.
So essentially no military in Syria then, based on what you just said?
Well, we're there now.
Right.
So, I mean, you have to basically deal with the situation at hand. Would I have chosen to enter into this effort the way that we have? And I know I'm not going to guess the administration's position at this point in time, but we're there now, and there's going to be some serious challenges to declaring victory in this particular.
And just to hold your feet to fire a little bit.
All right.
There's
My
there's talk.
toes getting toasty yet.
There's talk of ceasefire. There's talk of different solutions, keeping Assad in or having some sort of regime change. I mean, if you're saying that you wouldn't have advocated for the military to be there now, but it is there now, and we should sort of continue with that status quo as long as we need to.
No, that's not what I would advocate. Here's what my position is, and you have to look at what the crux of the issue is. I would be an advocate of targeting ISIS or other organizations that support terrorism around the world. You need to target them aggressively. 2 years ago, I talked about ISIS actually when I sat around this table. At the same time, when others in the government at the time did not take ISIS as seriously, because I recognized something then, and I think it's still true now. If you ignore a problem for too long and you don't address it right there where you discover it, it has a chance of becoming worse, and you'll have to pay more severe consequences to deal with it later. We're suffering under those consequences now. So right now, no, I'm not a happy camper in terms of where we are now. I would have preferred that we dealt with ISIS decisively right when we discovered them, so that they wouldn't be able to spread the way that they have and gain the power that they did. Now that they have, we need to come up with a new strategy to be able to contain and eliminate ISIS, and that is going to take military intervention. But as far as Syria is concerned, I don't think we should be in the game of regime change in Syria. The political the political playing field in Syria is not something that I think we should be focused on unto itself. We're in Syria to fight terrorism and ISIS, as far as I'm concerned, and whether it's in Syria or Iraq or anywhere else, I think we should do that.
Sure. Moving on very briefly to Iraq and Afghanistan, where there are slightly more stable governments, what do you think the U.S.'s role is in working with those governments in terms of their own fights, especially in Iraq, Islamic State?
Well, I think we made a mistake in Iraq. We made two major mistakes. We telegraphed to our enemies what we were planning on doing by telling them not only our exit strategy, but the date and time we were going to leave, which lo and behold, they exploited. They waited for us to go because they knew we were going to go. And they exploited that and decided to focus their efforts after we left. I think that was a mistake. We have to live with that mistake now. I think the lesson to be learned there is don't tell your enemies what you plan on doing. Target them aggressively. Leave all the options on the table to defeat them and win. And then prosecute those options as effectively and efficiently as you can when you get there. To answer your question specifically about Iraq, we do need to target ISIS in Iraq as well. We need to make sure that we target them everywhere they are in the world so that they cannot continue to sponsor terrorism against our allies and even right here in our homeland.
Okay.
Is that sort of the limited presence we have now with air support, or is it a more aggressive involvement?
You know, it could be more aggressive involvement, but once again, like I said, I think it's the important thing is that we don't telegraph to our enemies what we're going to do. Right. I think Hillary Clinton made a huge mistake when she came out publicly saying that she was not going to be an advocate of boots on the ground. Not because I'm an advocate of boots on the ground. I just don't think we should be telling our enemies what we plan on doing to them to win. I think we should win.
Okay. I was going to ask about accountability in that sense. So I guess if you do, one of the arguments for being forthright is that you're more accountable to American voters in terms of what the military is doing, what the strategies are. How do you square that up with what you're just describing?
I'm not sure I quite understand where you're going with the question.
Just if a lot of the reasons for the timelines for the Iraq and Afghanistan withdrawals were they were campaign promises and they were things that the president had stood for when he was elected. How does that? How are you able to sort of maintain some sort of accountability for the people?
Well, you know what, I think you're right. Public officials should be accountable to the people, but that's why I highlighted what Hillary Clinton said as a mistake, because I don't think that someone who has experience and knowledge in military strategy, which I was fortunate enough to have the taxpayers spend a considerable amount of resources to train me in military strategy, they should not be making campaign promises like that. Because if you become elected, at that point in time, now you have to make a tough choice. Do I do what's in the best interest of the military strategy that's going to protect my country and my national interests, or do I fulfill what I promised the voters? Candidates should be fulfilling their promises to the voters. But the problem is, the moment you make a promise like that, now you've eliminated an option that you may have at your disposal to help keep Americans safe. And you've also alerted your enemies that there are probably options that are going to be off the table later on strategically. I mean, our first and foremost duty should be to the American people.
Okay. Just one more foreign policy question on, there's two strong leaders right now in the Middle East who are also kind of looking at the wider map. You have Erdogan in Turkey, and you have Putin, and they both, especially in recent weeks, have sort of been seeming to take the lead, and especially in northern Syria and other areas. So how would you, what do you think the U.S.'s role is? What should it be, its relationship with these two leaders who often have their own reasons for wanting to get into these conflicts?
Well, I think that we owe both the American people and also our allies. Turkey is a member of NATO, as we all know. If you've heard any of my stump speeches, one of the concerns that I've brought up time and time again is that we've put ourselves in a position where, unfortunately, our allies may not feel like they can depend on us, and our enemies certainly do not fear us. And I think that you've brought up an example of two potential in both of those categories, Turkey being an ally and Russia being a potential foe. And I must admit that the actions of Russia more recently indicate that they might be getting closer to that foe category. And if you're looking for examples of that, the Russian fighters buzzing our naval ships in the open seas, the issues that we had discussing with Putin over his incursions into Ukraine, which is an ally of the United States. There are some problems potentially emerging there. And even more recently, we had the exchange where we both expelled our diplomats from each other's country because of various allegations of mistreatment. So that relationship there is teetering on the edge of a cliff that I think we need to pay attention to very closely. We need to take a strong position where we hold everyone accountable in the world for their actions. Turkey may be an ally of ours, but we should hold them accountable for their actions as well. I don't know if you picked up on the news more recently, but there have been some skirmishes on the border between some of the rebels that we're engaged in with fighting against ISIS in Syria and Turkey. So it just seems like we've got a very evolving situation there in that region with a lot of danger for the United States. I think, unfortunately, our foreign policy has led to us being in this position. And we need to be very careful as we proceed forward to make sure that we're being very diligent in terms of trying to do everything we can to create a more secure world and a more secure region in the Middle East. And I might add to that is that the more that we make missteps or mistakes with our foreign policy in terms of our strategies of dealing with these types of situations, the more we run the risk of having to use military force. And the goal should be to not have to use that military force.
So when you talk about holding foreign governments accountable for their actions, both allies and potential opponents. Outside of military, are you talking economic sanctions, or how would you hold Russia accountable?
Well, we've attempted multiple ways of trying to hold Russia accountable, including economic sanctions in the past. Russia is an interesting situation because obviously, because of their size, because of their power, military intervention when they're involved is probably not something that's a tenable situation for us at this time. We can put diplomatic pressure on them. You referenced sanctions. We have levied sanctions against them in certain times in the recent past. I don't know how effective that's been. I don't think Putin has blinked an eye too many times at the sanctions that we've levied against him. But I think you need to have all cards and all options on the table. You do need to put pressure on Russia to behave in a responsible fashion on the world stage. I, for one, don't think that we had a strong enough response when he sent members of his embassy staff into Baghdad to inform us that he was going to go into Syria just before he did. I think that's a situation where we should have monitored it a little bit more closely, and we should have had a little bit more of a more vocal response when he in fact did that. Because that is in fact creating complexities in the Syria situation that makes it more difficult for us to address it. And it goes back to that first question. You kind of asked me, well, what do we do now? Well, we're in a bad position. We need to make sure that we make prudent decisions going forward. But the smartest thing we can do now is make good policy decisions for foreign policy to try and prevent complexities like that from evolving. Russia being in Syria makes it more difficult to do our job in terms of targeting ISIS.
Well, so I guess I'm a little bit confused in terms of your response concerning Russia. You said you don't think it's probably a workable thing to respond militarily, but you also pointed out that we have tried economic sanctions to perhaps no avail.
Well, particularly with the Ukraine situation.
Right.
Go ahead.
So then, what other options do we have to put pressure on Russia to not be doing the things it's doing in the Ukraine, in Syria, elsewhere?
I do think that we had to do something in the case of the Ukraine. The sanctions, I don't think, deterred Putin and his government from doing what they've done. But I think there are some things that we can do prudently. Like if Putin really felt strongly that the United States would take a hard line in terms of defending its allies and NATO in particular, because that's probably the next situation that we'll be looking at talking about, because there are some members of NATO now that are part of what Putin in his rhetoric has been starting to talk about. If he felt strongly that we would defend our allies, if he felt strongly that there would be consequences, both economically and otherwise, from the world community, he may not feel so emboldened to act as he did in Ukraine. To answer your question succinctly, I think we have shown an inconsistent pattern of behavior in terms of dealing with foreign policy issues. And I think as a result, Putin has exploited that. So I think if we have a very consistent approach to our foreign policy, show Russia that we mean business, that we will support our allies, we will defend our allies, there will be economic consequences, severe economic consequences to certain actions. I think you would see him not carry forward with some of his actions, as he has in the past.
There's been a lot of talk in the primary on, you've mentioned targeting ISIS, and that being our primary goal. There's been a lot of talk about ways to do that, and there's been all sorts of different levels of engagement on that front. So there's been suggestions of carpet bombing. There's been smaller, scaled back kind of approaches. How far do you think we need to go in terms of going after terrorists? Do we follow them to their countries? Do we invade countries? Do we, and what does it look like, that kind of target?
You mean invade countries more than we already have? I mean, what are you asking?
Well, so I guess regardless of what we've done now or what we haven't done now, going forward, what would you advocate in terms of a strategy?
Well, I do believe that ISIS poses a threat both to our allies in the United States, both abroad and here at home. And I think it's important that we target them wherever they are in the world. So I would be an advocate of using the appropriate force. You're asking me how much force did I use? How much force would I advocate using? I think we need to use as much force as we need to dismantle their organization and stop them from being able to attack our interests.
And as they've started to lose territory in some senses, they've been seemingly lashing out in the last few months. This was a lot of attacks this summer, and a lot of people are saying this is what happens when they lose territory. They go more international. So what do we do against these kinds of so-called lone wolf attacks and these homebred attacks? What are the strategies that we need to employ on that front?
Okay, so that's a very broad question.
Right.
I'm going to focus on the Orlando shooting because that was the lone wolf attack that seemed to garner the most attention here in the United States. I've analyzed a lot of what has happened there, and if you look at the situation, here's a guy who we targeted as having terrorist connections. We brought him in, the FBI interviewed him at least twice that we know of, and then we let him go. And he committed a horrific act. Very, very unfortunate that this tragedy was allowed to happen. In my estimation, what we should be doing is we should be analyzing how and why we let an individual that was under suspicion for terrorist ties go without being investigated. I mean, we had him. We knew who he was. We knew who he was connected to. Unfortunately, he fell through the cracks. So to me, what it tells me is that we can identify who these people are. We can figure out who they're connected to. But we need to make sure that all of our communities are working together. The intelligence communities, law enforcement, need to work together to identify these people, keep the investigations active and open until we figure out what's going on with them, and make sure that these types of things don't happen. Does that guarantee that we'll never have another terrorist attack? Absolutely not. But we have to try to do the best work that we can to prevent these types of tragedies from happening. That's the only way you're going to stop these quote-unquote lone wolves that you're talking about. But the broader perspective of what we talked about earlier, with fighting against ISIS, with dismantling their ability to sponsor these types of activities in the future, that's the front line of this battle, and that's something that we should be focused on.
So I think one of the things that Ethan might have been getting at it is, yes, ideally you want to have great communication. You want to have everything in place so that our intelligence agencies will find everybody who's out there and stop them before they can do any damage. But as you're trying to do that, is there a place where you would draw the line? Should we be advocating or allowing torture? Should our intelligence agencies be free to spy on Americans in order to catch those few people who would do damage? What kind of limits do you think ought to be on the fight against terrorists, or should there not be?
Well, there definitely are some limits, and I'll tell you what the limits are. I do believe the Constitution is the highest law in the land. Our founding fathers put in place certain protections so that Americans could enjoy certain civil liberties that could not be infringed upon. Some of the things that you just alluded in terms of tactics to keep us safe, cross that line. And that's a line that I don't think we should ever cross. The day we give up our freedoms, the day we give up our civil liberties, is the day that the terrorists won anyway. So no, I'm not willing to sacrifice our constitutional rights for security.
Okay. You mentioned the Orlando shooter, and yes, intelligence agencies had talked with him. They had him kind of on their radar for a while, and yet he was free to go out and purchase weapons that he could use in the attack, which kind of touches then on Second Amendment rights. And you're talking about constitutional rights that are preeminent. So where would that line be drawn in terms of keeping those kinds of weapons out of the hands of people that ought not to have them? And how do you determine who ought not to have them?
Well, I think that the law is pretty clear on who ought to not have a weapon currently. I think if the law enforcement and intelligence communities got this one right, he would have been charged with something, or he would have been investigated to the point where they could draw that connection between him and the terrorist organizations, and he wouldn't have been allowed to buy a gun. And that's why I keep focusing on that. We do have laws in place to keep us safe, but it requires some diligence and enforcement in order for that to actually take effect. And I want to add to that, it's unfortunate he did use a gun in this particular case, and he killed a lot of innocent people who didn't deserve to die. But the reason why I keep focusing on why we need to close the gaps in our investigative procedures is because how would we have stopped the marathon bombers in Boston, for example? Their primary weapon of choice were pressure cookers. My strategy that I'm advocating would have stopped them too if we had been on to them and investigated them. And they, we potentially could have stopped them from buying a gun, but we wouldn't have stopped them from buying a pressure cooker. The recent terrorist attacks in Nice, where an individual attacked people primarily with a truck. France, as we know, has some of the most stringent gun control laws in the free world right now, and we couldn't keep those innocent people in France safe from somebody attacking them with a truck. So I think we need to be a little bit more comprehensive in our approach to make sure that we target the individuals that want to do us harm, because that's going to keep the largest number of people safe. I don't think you can pick and choose one little area, because unfortunately when you do that, you run the risk of ignoring a whole host of other things that could potentially create more victims. I want to keep all Americans safe. I want to stamp out all violence, not just one particular type of violence. And if I might add one other piece, there's been an increase that I've noticed recently in slashing violence or knife violence. We've seen it, increase there. Nobody really talks about it that much. It's not as compelling of an argument, but it's a type of violence that we do need to target as well. And there's a common thread to all of this, and we haven't really talked about it, but it's the lack of treatment for mental health that I think kind of undertones. There's an undertone of a mental health issue in this country that we just, for some reason, don't feel compelled to want to target directly or address. We should be talking about how outraged we are at targeting all violence. And I think through law enforcement investigation, as well as restoring maybe some of the resources that are available to target early intervention for mental health, will keep a whole lot of Americans safe from violence.
Okay. Well, since you bring it up, so early intervention, putting more resources into that, or how do we address mental health issues?
Well, it's kind of hard to do something without resources, but I'm going to go a little bit further back. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't know, but about 8 years ago, we took a lot of resources away from the treatment of the mentally ill in this country. It didn't get a lot of press coverage. A lot of people didn't focus on it. But I think we're seeing the end result of that policy change. We've had recent incidents even in our own state. We had a cop in Manchester that was shot by someone who was diagnosed mentally ill. We've had recent instances even south of our border in Massachusetts where an individual went to a mall and stabbed a bunch of people. Someone who was released from a hospital bed that day because his insurance ran out, and he went and targeted a bunch of innocent people in a mall. We see this time and time again where violence is actually perpetrated against American citizens, and there's this underlying mental health issue there that realistically, if we aggressively were putting resources to bear there, if treatment was available, we might be able to avoid some of that. I mean, we've seen our very own recently retired Chief Justice in this state advocating for more mental health awareness, more focus put on mental health issues in this country. I do think that this is a serious problem, and I think it's an area where it's a problem, just like ISIS. Remember I said we ignore a problem, it becomes bigger, and then you have to pay a penalty later on because it's more difficult to try and deal with it later on. I think this is another example of that.
Okay. I'm going to switch from what we've been talking about a little bit. What do you think are of our national energy policy, and what should we be doing moving forward?
Well, this is actually something that's pretty close to what the focus, or a lot of the focus of my candidacy is, and we haven't really talked about it at all. I think one of the biggest issues that we have right now is how do we balance our government policy with stimulation of our economy. The past 8 years, we've had our highest GDP growth rate year is 3%. That's abysmal. 8 years with a GDP growth rate no higher than 3%. Our economy is very, very sluggish. And I do believe that a lot of our government policies have resulted in our economy not being able to take off the way that it normally would be able to. I mean, our biggest strength historically have been the American people and our industry. What happened to the times of when we won World War II just based off of the industrial might of the United States and the American people? Our businesses are tired. They've been overregulated. The government has been constricting their ability and their flexibility to be able to provide good paying jobs. Our tax structure has made us less than competitive with the rest of the world. We see company after company trying to flee the United States, relocating their facilities overseas. We've seen some politicians trying to come up with some knee-jerk reaction policies to try and keep American companies to stay on our shores. But to me, the answer is actually really simple. If we create a competitive environment for our countries to stay in the United States, they will stay. That's how these other countries are enticing our businesses to go over to their country, is because they're creating environments where companies feel that if they make capital investments into these countries, that there'll be a good rate of return on their business. We need to start seriously looking at some of these issues. Energy is an important component of that, because every business that we have relies on energy. It's usually a key component of their expenditure. Earlier today, I was just down at Whalen Engineering touring their facility there. They're doing some incredible things there to keep and maintain manufacturing jobs right here in our state in New Hampshire, right here in the United States. This is something that people are saying can't be done. This is saying, there are many out there that feel like manufacturing in the United States is gone. You know what the number one thing that their outgoing CEO told me that they deal with that keeps them up at night? Their cost of energy. Imagine that. We know this is true. So anything we can do from a policy standpoint to help us have safe, reliable, environmentally responsibly produced energy in this country, we need to start putting that forward. And I think, unfortunately, the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction. We've been very good at coming up with policies on how we can try and provide energy that's environmentally responsible, but we haven't really looked at that cost component. And I don't think that we've seriously understood that the cost component drives business either in or out of the environment that they're in, depending on how available, cheap and reliable energy is. I mean, one of the things I noticed when I came here, before I came up here, I noticed that you guys still have the printing presses in this building. How many newspapers in the country can still say that they do that? I don't know of anyone else. Do you?
You mean that it has a press in the same building, or doesn't have a press at all?
Well, most of them don't have a press at all, but you've got it right here.
But we also print other newspapers, so that's...
Well, that's good. I bet you would probably appreciate some cheaper energy costs to run those presses, right?
Oh, sure, yeah.
So,
You mentioned tax structure, and you said 2 years ago, and are saying again this time around, that we need a fairer and flatter tax structure. So what exactly does that look like?
okay, when I say that, though, I'm really focusing more on the individual income tax. If you look at our tax code, the U.S. tax code, I think you might go broke trying to print that because it's so large. I mean, we just keep adding on to that. It's so complicated. Most CPAs can't even understand everything that's in there. There's a fairness issue here because I think every American, at a minimum, should be able to understand how much they owe. The other offshoot of that is because it's so big, unwieldy, and complex, you're almost creating an extra bureaucracy just to deal with tax compliance. I mean, the IRS has grown out of sight over the years. If you look at the amount of resources that go into keeping taxpayers compliant, we should be able to have a simpler tax code so that people can understand what they owe. It could be crystal clear whether you're paying what you owe, or what you don't owe, and we can get off the stage. But we don't have that right now. And the other piece of it is that it depends on what your philosophy is. My philosophy is that if you have a flatter tax rate, in other words, if you don't have this wide spread out progressive tax code system, one, you'll create a simpler tax code so people will know what they owe. Two, you'll have a higher compliance rate, so you'll actually be able to collect more. And three, you won't need so many loopholes that we have now so that people can pick and choose whether they owe taxes or they don't owe taxes. Right now, the system is not fair, it's too complex, it's unwieldy, and it creates bureaucracy. It's not good for our government, and it's not good for our industry. So it's time to change. You were asking about business taxes. That's something different.
Well, let's before doing that, then let's talk about that. So what do you propose in terms of, yes, it's an extremely large, complex thing, our tax code for income tax. So what is your proposal? I mean, you talk about having a flatter tax, that would be simpler. But yes, if you said everybody's going to pay X percent, that would be slightly less complicated than saying, if you make this much, you pay this. If you make this much, you pay this. You make this much, you pay this. I mean, that doesn't seem a whole lot more complex. It's when you get into loopholes and breaks and rebates and all of the deductions that people get. So, yes, you make it less complex, but in what way? What would you do?
Well, I would be lying to you if I said that I could give you a detailed plan succinctly on over 20,000 pages of tax code right now, but I could tell you where I would start. What I would start to look at doing is, and keep in mind what we're talking about doing is, this system came into place over a series of decades. Mm-hmm. So I don't believe good government comes from a knee-jerk reaction. And taking that entire tax code and slamming it away in one fell swoop, in my mind, would be a knee-jerk reaction.
Okay.
We always need to be mindful of the unintended consequences of our actions in government. When we go too fast and we make changes too swiftly without understanding the consequences of those actions, we actually increase the risk of doing more damage to a system we're supposed to be fixing. And that's why I don't come straight out and say, well, I think it should be a flat tax at XYZ%. And there's another factor in that. We started this off by talking about fiscal policy, and we haven't really talked about the other specter in the room that I always talk about, which is our $19.2 trillion in debt. I think that we owe the American people our due diligence to analyze what our fiscal policy is going to be, and we have to keep in mind what our affordability level is, what our national debt is, which I think we should fight very hard to reduce and eliminate quickly, and what our national debt is. You can't afford to have broad sweeping tax reform without analyzing what the impact is going to be on the spending side as well. Because I can't imagine what $19.2 trillion today could be if we made a few missteps without analyzing what that impact was going to be. So the tax structure that I would be advocating for would be less complicated, simplified, try and close some loopholes where applicable, bring the progressive tax code bandwidth, narrow that. That's why I say flatter, I don't say completely flat. And have a migration plan that can get us to a point where we can have a simpler tax code, still get the tax receipts that we need to be able to responsibly afford the government that we have now, make prudent cuts to government where applicable, and improve efficiency so that we can eliminate our debt and shrink our deficit spending and move on from there. But that's an entire process that you're going to have to do in conjunction with looking at the whole big picture. You don't want to pick and choose and make decisions for one area that can negatively impact you somewhere without looking at all the consequences. I think we did that with the Affordable Care Act. Remember, they looked at it and they said, oh, well, we'll tell you what's in the bill after we pass it. Well, we know what's in it now. We've got higher premiums. Our health care is more expensive. We have less alternatives. They've limited options. And we still haven't put all of the Americans on health care.
That's actually a perfect segue. So you're advocating, obviously, repealing the ACA.
Well, be careful, because I want to be very specific. I just told you something about my belief system. Mm-hmm. 2 years ago, I definitely said repeal it all. But now that they've had it in place for several years now, you'd have to go back and do a full analysis of what's going on right now with the system, who's using it. You can't just rip legislation that's actually put in place and throw it away now and expect there not to be a ripple effect. So I'm for responsible repealing of provisions in this law that's not working.
So specifically, what would you target?
Well, the first thing that I think you need to look at is, and I think the flaws in it have been shown, is the Cadillac tax that they keep failing to implement. One of the reasons why I don't think they've implemented it is because they realize what the overall impact that would have on our economy and on employers' ability to provide good health care insurance for their employees. So that right there unto itself, that provision has a lot of problems with it. But I also want to look at doing some smart solutions, some market-driven solutions that we haven't fully addressed yet. For example, I think people should be able to cross state lines to be able to purchase their health insurance. That's a good idea whose time is long overdue. We know that market forces, if you broaden that market and you increase people's options, you should be able to drive costs down.
The individual mandate, where do you stand on that? Obviously, that's in the law. It's been there for a while. It's implemented. Is that something you can roll back, or would you want?
I think that's something that you can talk about rolling back. Once again, we need to really look at the things that have damaged our healthcare system, the things that aren't working, and we need to replace it with things that are smart that will work. That doesn't mean that I don't want people to have healthcare. What I want is for people to have healthcare, and I don't want to break the healthcare system that we now have.
Sure. And one of the aims, at least, of the individual mandate was to take down premiums. How would you?
How did that work?
Well, I mean, not putting that aside. What would your approach be in terms of looking to more free market strategies to bringing down premiums? How would that look?
Well, I just said the first and foremost thing. I mean, the low-hanging fruit. Allow people to cross state lines. I can't believe that we're still talking about this now and it hasn't been done. Especially for people that live in a state like we do in New Hampshire, where we have limited options naturally because of market forces. Broaden the market. Give people more options. Bring more competition in. Competition has a general has a tendency to drive down prices. We know that across all the markets, so why not do that?
So we hear that as a solution a lot.
Mm-hmm.
For
But nobody ever
candidates.
does it.
So what exactly would that look like? The example people often use as well is why can't you go to Massachusetts, where there are some really great hospitals and providers, and get access there to a plan there? So would you be talking about something where you'd have a bunch of regional plans, or would this be an open thing where an insurer from Texas or Alaska might offer a plan and you say, well, sure, New Hampshire people ought to have access to that, but then how would they have access to New Hampshire providers? So exactly how would that be set up?
Well, I'll give you a real life example. The provider from Texas, it still boils down to the provider being willing to service the customers in that state. Right now, the way the system is set up, they can't because of the laws in place that we have now and the approval process for approving providers for health insurance in the states currently. That vendor from a different state can't cross into New Hampshire to provide that insurance. But if you change the law, you change the policy, you're right, they would still have to be willing to do that. And if they were willing to do it, it means that they would have to have agreements with those providers in that region. And in my very own small business, I had a plan that I provided for my employees. Now, it wasn't a national plan, but it did allow them to use any provider in the New England area. It can be done. It's just a matter of us making smart policy decisions to break down the governmental barriers that are in place to preclude this from happening.
In terms of the Medicaid expansion that came along with a lot of Obamacare, where would you, obviously a lot of states, that's been a controversial thing state by state, so where do you fall in terms of that and in terms of the people who have right now been utilizing those services since the ACA was put in place?
Well, I'm going to go back to my original answer. 2 years ago, I was for repealing Obamacare because the law was new enough that you would have been able to enact reasonable legislation to draw back some of those provisions and come up with something else with minimal impact to the users. Once again, unintended consequences. Now that you have users, you need to figure out how you're going to service that group now before you replace it, before you withdraw that benefit. I think that's responsible government. I am not for Medicare expansion because I view it as feeding or continuing to feed a less effective solution to our health care, and it's basically feeding the flawed policies of the ACA. But you have to have an alternative in place before you do that. So that's going to be a tough decision for lawmakers, particularly in the state later on. I would be an advocate of giving them as many free market options as I could in the future, so that the people who are actually relying on that system for their health care wouldn't have to go without health care.
I wonder if I could just follow up a little bit on fiscal policy matters, because you were talking about it, and related to the debt as well. But so, what approaches do you think should be taken with regard to entitlements like Medicare, Social Security?
Okay. Social Security is an interesting one because it's another situation that I think we get this trend here. It's been ignored for too long. We now know, we have the evidence, we've already knew it intuitively, but we have the hard facts that let us know that Social Security is going to be insolvent if we don't do something now to fix it here in the near future. My plan to save Social Security would be, first and foremost, to pass legislation to fence off the payroll taxes that are collected for Social Security, so that they could not be spent in on other things other than Social Security benefits. I think that's the first step that has to be taken before you could talk about doing anything to save Social Security, because if you don't do that piece, then you can do all the other maneuvering that you need to do to make it solvent, and you're not protecting that funding from being raided again and creating another crisis. So that would be step one. Step two becomes the hard part of the process. You're going to have to sharpen the pencil, make some tough decisions in order to make Social Security in its entirety solvent before the drop dead date. It's going to be a little bit painful, but the sooner you do it, the less painful it's going to be. It's going to be a lot easier to implement those types of changes now than it will be to implement them 10 years from now, after the system has continued to erode even more and the hole has been dug deeper. In terms of what should be on the table, you have to leave everything on the table. You have to look at raising the cap on payroll taxes. You have to look at age of recruitment. You need to look at eligibility requirements. You have to
By
leave.
that you mean age of eligibility?
I'm sorry?
By that do you mean age of eligibility?
Age of eligibility is a key component of that, but when I say eligibility, we use Social Security for a lot more than what it was originally intended to now. So, I think you need to look at everything. You need to look across the spectrum to see what areas that it might be a blended solution. It might be a combination of all of those things. Means testing is another thing that you need to take into consideration.
But maybe I didn't ask it carefully enough, but I just want to be clear on this. So would raising the retirement age be one of the items
Yes.
you'd have on the table? Yeah.
Yes, I think you need to look at all of them, because in order for you to make it solvent, you're going to have to figure out how to raise the taxes that you're going to put into the system, or figure out a way how to make the payments that you're sending out more affordable based on what you're bringing in. There's no other way to solve the problem. So you have to make a decision one way or the other, and then you have to fix it. And by fencing the funding, you could go a long way of ensuring that we're not facing this crisis again 30 or 40 years later once you go through all the steps to fix it. But you do need to do it. I think the sooner you do it, the better. I think it's very unfortunate that we kept kicking this can down the road and we're in this position now. But there's going to have to be some unpopular decisions made to fix it. It's better for us to fix it now than later.
Moving to education. So you have taken positions against Common Core. I think just to get you clear, it's repealing Common Core, right? Or pulling it back, not repealing it.
Yeah, I don't believe that Washington, D.C. bureaucrats are necessarily the people that can make best decisions for our education for our kids. It's kind of interesting. This is a very interesting thing for me to talk about, because my wife is a 20-year educator. So it makes for some interesting conversations on the home front, not to mention the fact that I have 8 kids as well. But Common Core I view as the lowest common denominator philosophy of developing curriculums for our children. We look to our neighbor to the south, Massachusetts, who for many years has been viewed as a community that invests a lot in their education and has gotten some recognition for the types of public school education systems that they have in place. It's very interesting to see that the state of Massachusetts has rejected the testing that would have been the standard for Common Core. And I think they recognized what I've said all along, is that Common Core is not necessarily the answer for all communities in all states in the United States. Are there some public school systems in the United States that are suffering? Yes, there are. But the answer is not to take education systems that are working fairly well for their communities and drag them down to a Washington, D.C. solution to elevate others that are failing. I don't think that's in the best interest of any of us. I do believe that there are some smart things that we can do for education to improve systems that are failing, but to force everybody into a one-size-fits-all curriculum is not the answer.
So if there are some schools that need whatever Common Core is meant to give them, are you suggesting a more flexible system that allows for more waivers where it's not needed, or are you just saying scrap it all and if so, how do those schools get the?
I think unfortunately,
assistance they need?
in this case, because we're talking about something very specific, Common Core, I think it's so flawed at this point that you have to start from ground zero. You need to get rid of it. Nobody talks about this piece of it. One of the emerging areas of education that we're struggling with right now is special education. And Common Core is absolutely abhorrent for that segment of our educated population. So, it just goes to show you, if you get a bunch of people in a room in one city that's really away from your community, that's not really dealing with the situation on a day-to-day basis, they really run a high risk of making decisions with a lot of negative unintended consequences that people that are sitting there fighting on the front line would know better ways of addressing and dealing with. So I think Common Core has some pretty admirable goals that it wants to achieve. It just can't get there.
And so you say there are schools, though, that are in need of assistance. Is the federal government out of that role in your concept, or is it a block grant kind of thing? I'm just trying to.
Potentially, it could be a block grant. Fortunately, I think we live in a state where that's not the case. I think our school systems work fairly well. I think, unfortunately, Yeah.
But
I think, unfortunately, there are some other states in the United States where they're not as fortunate. Can the federal government do some stuff to assist those states? Yes, I'm sure they can. But we shouldn't be penalized for that. Our students shouldn't have to suffer for that. Our children shouldn't have to have less of an education as a result of that policy.
Well, so rather than a process that, as you're describing, kind of pulls the education down in states where it's working well in order to pull the others up. But is there a place for some sort of national standard for education, or if Mississippi or Arkansas is having real trouble in that area, you just say, well, let that state deal with it. If they don't put money into it, so be it. But we're fine in New Hampshire.
That's not what I said.
No, I'm asking. I'm not saying that's what you said.
I don't want to say, but there's one little piece of this puzzle that we really didn't talk about, and I know this firsthand because my community in Hudson was one of the first in the state to roll out Common Core extensively. There was a considerable cost with doing this. So we just talked about a system that potentially didn't benefit our students, but then it increased the actual cost that school districts were spending to educate our children. So I'm sorry, that's an example of Washington, D.C. hurting our community. I think we need to be very careful on how we help, and I'm using that term very loosely, help people from Washington, D.C. fix their problems. Because this is a case where I think they got it wrong. They actually hurt our educational system instead of helping it. If they're going to help an educational system somewhere else that needs the help, they need to do it in a different way that doesn't break the whole system.
Okay. You talked earlier about foreign policy and our relationship with other countries. Obviously, economics is one of those ways. What should our approach to trade be?
Okay. I'm a big believer of free trade. I do think that yields the best results economically for all people involved. I'm going to go right into some recent trade agreements because people have had a lot of discussions about that. I believe in free trade, but unfortunately I think more often than not we enter into trade agreements with partners under the false pretense of free trade, and it doesn't really end up being that way. A lot of people are talking about TPP now, and I think that there are a lot of dangers involved in that, particularly because there's not a lot of insight into what's really completely being discussed there. But what I do know is that some of our trading partners, particularly China, and I don't want to single them out, but I'm going to use an example, they have a tendency to have manipulated their currency to skew the trade balance. This is an example where I see we could have a trade agreement with a partner, and they may take some actions in the future that would shift the playing field to their advantage and would hurt American interests. I think any trade agreement that we enter into, there needs to be some due diligence performed to ensure that American interests are protected. And our trading partners are actually going to really enter into free trade with us. And it's not a trade agreement that we'll honor and follow. And they'll just use it to shift the trade balance in their favor.
So you oppose trade agreements and rather just let everybody trade?
No, I just think that we need to make sure that if we have a trade agreement, that it's got enough teeth in it, and we're smart enough to understand what those teeth need to be to make sure that we really do have free trade and somebody doesn't take advantage of the American people.
And what if they do?
Well, if we do the agreement correctly and it has teeth in there, then whatever that agreement stipulates, if you follow the agreement, it should take care of itself. The only time it would be a problem is if we enter into a free trade agreement with some other party and we haven't put the teeth in the agreement to make sure that they're supposed to really trade freely with us. There's a loophole that they exploit, and shame on us for not catching that ahead of time.
So with regard to the specific trade agreements that are in place, or in the case of TPP proposed, are there flaws in there that you would like to see redone? Do you think they should be done away with? And maybe you need to talk about each of them not as one, so I don't want to overgeneralize.
Well, I think I hit on what my key concern would be with the TPP in particular. I think that I would want to see some more provisions ensuring that, for example, China would have severe sanctions for currency manipulation. Things that they've done in the past that have, in my estimation, skewed the balance of trade in their favor. Those things, to my knowledge, are not in there currently. And I would want to see those types of protections put in any trade agreement before I could say I would endorse that.
And how about NAFTA? Because that's got a lot of focus in the primary campaign, for instance, in both parties, is that it's taking jobs away and the like. Do you think that's an accurate portrayal of it, or do you think it's a good structure?
You know, I think that, and unfortunately, my personal belief is that we've done more damage through our tax code structure for businesses There were a lack of competitiveness. We talked about energy policy. I think that our governmental policies are more to blame for companies and jobs leaving the United States than anything. So I think the more we could focus on that, the better off we're going to be in the future.
So NAFTA is, you think as a concept is fine enough. It's the tax side of it that's where you would develop.
Tax and overregulation of business.
Okay, great.
Because if we can lift some of those restrictions and encourage business and have business grow and make capital investments in this country, we should be exporting to a lot of our NAFTA trade partners. That would be my goal.
Really quickly, because we're running a little long. If you were elected, you would be entering into a political body that doesn't have much trust in the American people and often doesn't really get too much lately.
I think it's the other way. People don't have a lot of trust in the body.
Yeah, sorry, that's
I'm one of them.
Right. So how would you, especially with this election year, it seems that whatever happens, there's going to be some strong bitterness. How would you seek to effect some change within a system that's like that right now? What do you think would be the approach you could take as a freshman lawmaker?
Well, I think it's not that different from when I entered into the state legislature as a freshman legislator. I think the difference now is that I have that experience having gone through that once. No lone voice going down to Washington, D.C. is going to have the ability to affect change by himself. I know this now. I know as a freshman legislator, I'm going to have to work very hard to find like-minded individuals, build coalitions, work together with others, work with legislators on either side of the aisle to come up with real solutions. So my goal would be to do just that, to find people who are more interested in providing solutions than the party letter that comes after their name, and come up with some smart, efficient, and effective decisions to help the people of this great state and our nation.
Well, all right then. I guess that's a wrap, unless you get something else you wanted us to ask you.
I think you guys did a good job. But thanks for having me.
All right.
We didn't ask, are you endorsing Trump, or have you?
I'm going to support Donald Trump for one reason alone. His policies and the direction that he is advocating for America to go in is more closely aligned with mine. I can't think of a single policy that Hillary Clinton, unfortunately, would be an advocate of that I would support at this time.
So that's an endorsement.
Well, I'm not going to mince words. Endorsement and support, I don't think it really means that much to go. I mean,
Some people don't think it does either in this state, apparently. But
well, the reality is that Donald Trump's vision for, what his policies that he's laid out for, I don't agree with everything that he said, but there are more areas that I agree with him than I do Hillary Clinton.
okay.